Hi, welcome back to the 4Caillou series. This one's called range extraction. A format for expressing an ordered list of integers is to use a comma-separated list of either individual integers or a range of integers denoted by the starting integer separated from the end integer in the range by a dash. The range includes all integers in the interval, including both endpoints. It is not considered a range unless it spans at least three numbers. For example, 12, 13, and then you see the range 15 to 17. Since you have 15, 16, 17, it meets the minimum size of 3. Complete the solution so that it takes a list of integers in increasing order and returns a correctly formatted string in the range format. So they give us one example here. It looks like it's going from -10 to -8. You can see -7 is skipped, so you get the range here. You get an individual, then you have another range. 3, 2, 1 would be a range, right? It skipped 2, start a new one from 3 to 5, 6 is skipped, 7 to 11. You can scroll, and I think that's pretty clear, right? You can see that in the output below here. And then feel free to look through the test cases as well if you want a couple other examples. In general, it doesn't hurt to peek at the test cases because they might show you some edge cases that you weren't thinking about, like this case, where it can be simplified. But anyway, I think that's clear enough. Go ahead and try the challenge. Come on back when you're ready. Okay, do a little formatting here, and we are underway. Okay, let's start by doing some validation and handle this simplified case that I mentioned. We can end quickly if we have small input like that. So yeah, if you're in the paranoid club like me, you could do something like if args equals null, or args dot length is less than 1, you could throw an exception, right? The challenge probably won't test this, but feel free to include something like this or not, up to you. Now let's handle that quick case where we have just 2 elements, right? So if there's only 2, it's impossible to have a range, right? Because a range requires at least 3 elements. So we can return pretty quickly here. We can say if args.length is less than 3, right? We could say, I suppose I could say, yeah, we'll do it that way, less than 3. We'll say return string join, and we'll separate them by commas, and we'll just say args, right? And we've used string join before. We'll just do what you think it does and put commas between each of these values, which is the format they expect when something isn't a range, right? It's just the number in a comma. So good. We don't have to worry about any kind of meddling or do anything complicated when the input doesn't even qualify to have a range. Okay, so now we're on to the general case. How do we go about this? Well, my strategy, I'm naturally going to have a string variable here to store our output, and I'm going to build that output over time as we sort of step through the args. And then for my implementation, it's not the most efficient thing, but it made the problem really easy to solve. I'm going to use a list of integers that defines a range, and the idea is that to start, we load values, and as long as the next value is 1 higher, I keep loading this list that I'm going to call a range. And then you can imagine at some point we're going to hit a value that doesn't qualify. It sort of terminates the range, and at that time I'll sort of use the values in range to append a range onto the string result that I'm maintaining. So let me add some of those local variables here. Let's go string result, and I'll say list of int, call it range, new list int. Okay, then it's ready to use, right? Almost, we know, using system collections generic for list. Okay, good. So this is going to be our local state here, and this will help us immensely. Now we can set up the for loop that's going to step through the args. Let's do that. Nothing special. For int I equals 0. I is less than args dot length, and increment I. This is going to go through. We'll define the scope of our for loop. Very good. Okay, so first things first. We want to initially start building the range, right? The first value will automatically go into range, and then the other time we'll add the input is when its value is one higher than the previous. So we can achieve that with something like if I equals 0, right? That means our first pass, I'm just going to automatically put the first value in range. Just assume by default that it's part of a range. If it's not, it's okay, it'll work out. And then the other condition would be args I equals args I minus 1 plus 1. And we should be protected here, right? Because when I is 0, it'll satisfy this condition, and it will short circuit and bypass the rest. If I is greater than 0, then we don't have to worry about args I minus 1, right? But those will be safe calls to make. Good. So in that case, we're going to just simply add, oops, we want to add the value to our range. We've worked with lists before, and so we're going to say add args I. And then at this point, I'm going to consider it done. So I'm going to add this continue keyword here. And this just says, hey, don't execute anything below this if statement. It says go straight back to the top of the for loop and run another loop. It'll bump I up, increment, and start over. So good, and you can imagine, right? The first value gets added. Let's say the second value is +1, like over here. It gets added. -8 would get added, right? But eventually we hit the -6 where it's not one more than the previous value. And that's sort of when we get to this logic I'm about to type next. So in that case, basically when we get here, I want to convert the values in range to some text string that I can just sort of tack on to result. And then hopefully you can see by doing this, in general, whenever we determine the end of a range, we can just keep doing that. And so I'm going to make a method to help us out with that. I'm going to call it append list to output, something like that, right? And we'll implement this. So let's make a method for this. Private static void append list to output. And so we'll pass in our list. I'll just call it values, something like that. And then I'm going to pass in our result string, and I'm going to do that by reference so we can work with the value itself. Reference string, I'll just call the parameter name output, right? So yeah, it'll take, imagine we've populated this with some values, one or more, and then we'll pass our result string in here, and it will just, we'll do the logic to take these values and handle them appropriately. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we have a couple cases. If the count is greater than or equal to 3, then we have a range, right? So let's handle that. We could say if values count is greater than or equal to 3. That means we should format this thing as a range with the hyphen between the low and the high in the range, the endpoints of the range. So we can say output plus equals, and let's make a range here. We could say values 0 for the first one, right? Then a hyphen. Oops, I'm sorry, I gotta close. There we go. Then a hyphen, and now I'm gonna insert another value. Values values.count minus 1, which just means the last value, right? So nothing fancy here. We're just saying the first value right there, then add a hyphen, and then the last value in the range, right? Pretty clear. And then one other little nicety I'm going to put in. You can imagine we're going to be calling this append list to output multiple times as we're going through our loop there. So let's just do a thing where let's check to see if output is not empty. And if it's not, then we'll add a comma before we drop our range in. So this output plus equals line I just did would provide the 7 to 11, but I want to get this comma in there too, right? So I'm going to say if not string is null or empty, and that would be output. I mean, it's already been built up with some values. Let's make sure we go ahead and say output plus equals a comma. And then it will add commas as needed and then drop the values in. So that's good. We made a range there in the case where it should be treated as such. And so let's handle the other case where it was less than 3, where maybe you started building up 2, you were close, but you didn't quite get a range. So we got to treat them as individual entries, right? Those are the rules of the challenge. So we could say, and you know what, this is going to be common to both branches. So let's just set this outside. It should execute either way. Then we're going to have an else. And again, even in the case that we're just doing individual values, we still want a comma if we need it. So that's why I did that. It fires off regardless, if needed. Okay, so now we're just going to step through the values in values and sort of add them one at a time. So let's do that. We can do that with a simple for loop as well. And I equals 0. I is less than values dot count and plus plus I. Good. Okay, so yeah, let's just do them one at a time. So we can say output plus equals, and we could say values I, just add the value to it, and then I'm going to add a comma as necessary, but I don't want to add it necessarily to the last element, right? We don't want our final string. Imagine if this 17 to 20 had a comma after it. We don't want that to happen. So I'm not going to automatically put a comma at the end. And to achieve that, I can say, oops, if values dot count, if I is less than values dot count minus 1, meaning we're not on the last value, right? It's somewhere before the last element in the values array or list. Then we'll say, okay, it's okay to add a comma because we know another value is coming after it. Something like that. All right, good. So we've handled both cases where we had a range or we just had a stretch of numbers. So yeah, let's run with that, assume that works for now. And then this makes life pretty easy, right? So we said once we get to this point in the loop, we had sort of arrived at a situation where a range is done. But a new one could be starting, right? So I want to point out, and you got to be careful that you don't jump over stuff. So consider this span that went from -3 to 1. So it ended on the value 3, but 3 in fact was the start of a new range. So you got to be careful that you don't say, hey, our range ended, and just sort of move on to the next index without checking for that. So to that end, then we can simply, well, I mean, first we should use our method, right? Ref result. Okay. We'll add that. And then to make sure that we sort of include the new value in our range, just in case it's starting a new valid range, what we'll do is, since we logged this, we can say range clear, right? Just blow it away. We already logged all the values. We don't want to leave them in there so they end up getting printed again in another step through the loop, right? So that's why we're clearing. And then I'm just going to say range add args I. And so that's going to take that current value, like the 3 in the example we were talking about, and just start from there. You know, it's like you're at I equals 0 again. You know, you can think of it that way, like you're just starting fresh again. So we're just going to assume it's part of a range to start. And if it's not, we saw our helper method will handle that. So good. That should do what we need it to do. It'll just keep stepping through this, sort of building up a range, then spitting it out to the result as the ranges are completed, and it will handle the case where it didn't have quite enough elements to make a range. So you can imagine through this for loop, we're mostly good, right? But we could have a situation where we had sort of been building up a range and it never quite output. So we should handle that case as well. So in the event of that, I can check. I can say if after we're all done with the for loop, if there's anything left in here, right? We could just do the same thing. We can just say append list to output, just in case anything got caught in the range and never got written out. So I think that'll help us. And then finally, oops, I jumped too far. We should be able to simply return our result if we did everything right. So let's run this, see how it's going. Error, name exception, yeah, sure. So I had used exception here. Of course, we didn't define that. So let's bring in the system namespace. That should take care of our other trouble too, I would think. Okay, green. We'll hit the attempt and green. Good. And so like I said, the challenge isn't gonna test us on this, so if you want to remove that to clean up your solution sum, you can. If you like to leave it as a best practice, go ahead. So yeah, we had that simple case. There's only 2. It's impossible to have a range in it. Then just join them with a comma. Nice and easy. Otherwise, we had these 2 state variables sort of build our result as we go. This handy range list we use to hold elements as we encountered subsequent elements that were, you know, increasing by 1 each time. And then whenever that stopped, whenever we didn't meet that criteria, we'd sort of spit out whatever we have and then clear it and start anew and just rinse and repeat, right? And so, and then we had that little catch at the end, right, in case anything was left over in range and didn't quite get spit out. And if you want to see if this is actually useful, go ahead and comment it out and see what happens. And you can see that, yeah, so like they expected a -37 at the end and we didn't get that. It was -39, right? We ended early because that -37 would have been stuck in our range list there. So yeah, that just sort of empties the buffer, you know, your collection that you were building up in case anything was left over. And so yeah, really pretty simple, right? Once you make this helper method that sort of converts the range into a proper format and even handles the case that it's not actually a range and just sort of prints them out as individual elements. And you can keep tacking that on to your output. It should be noted though, where this solution is weak is that we created this extra list collection. And you can imagine I keep building this thing up. Imagine you had a really long stretch, hundreds of integers in a range, and I'm sort of doing them one at a time in this range, right? Just to ultimately grab the first value and the last value in that range. So that could be a lot of wasted space, if you wanted to criticize an approach like this. It won't be the most performant when we submit, right? But it made the problem really easy to think about and work with. And if you're in a context where performance wasn't critical, resources weren't at a minimum, you knock this thing out in a matter of minutes and you're on to more work, and there's something to be said about that too. So I'll go ahead and submit like this. I don't think I have any comments lurking around in here. So yeah, go ahead and get your honor points too. And then yeah, this would be a good one to look through for sure. Let's see all the different ways people chose to think about this problem. I'm going to do that too. But otherwise, yeah, hit me up with your comments, questions. I especially like seeing your solutions, even if you don't, copy and paste a bunch of code in the chat if it's too big to do that. Even just telling me, what your strategy was, how you solved it, that can be helpful to give us other ways to think about solving these kind of problems. But anyways, as usual, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in another challenge.